Hello Irlandia.
Hi, and welcome to another edition of the US News. I'm Aga Qubica, broadcasting for you at Hello Irlandia. I'll begin with some close-to-home news. This week, censorship affected me personally. This episode was censored by the Dublin radio station that lends us the band, despite the fact that it was originally made in my native language. Consequently, the entire Thursday program has been banned, including the non-controversial material about Ireland and Poland prepared by two other journalists. My news, in its current form, will no longer appear in Dublin City FM unless I cooperate under conditions, which I am not willing to do. Also, our Hello Irlandia team is launching its independent website, where we will be publishing our materials in accordance with our own principles. And also, you can follow us on our social media channels. That is, as long as they exist. In today's episode, I will analyze the controversial case which evoked a wave of protests across the US. A video was broadcast on mainstream media in which a white law enforcement officer killed a black man in an extremely brutal manner by pressing his knee to his neck for about 8 minutes and consequently ending the man's life. The policeman was identified as Derek Chauvin, an officer from Minneapolis. His victim was George Floyd, who moved to Minneapolis from Houston in 2014. Floyd was dismissed from his regular job due to the coronavirus state shutdown, and on the unfortunate Monday, May 25th, 2020, he allegedly tried to give the owner of a small grocery store a counterfeit $20 banknote. The shop owner called the police, but Floyd apparently decided to wait for it in front of the very same store. The officers arrived after about 20-30 minutes, and we know the rest. But do we, really? There are a few issues in question here. Floyd wasn't the first black person ever to be reported by the media to have died due to police brutality, yet the angry crowds took to the streets demanding justice en masse during the pandemic. It is a fact that individual states are already beginning to abolish the strict rules of isolation and staying at home. But a state of Minnesota, where Minneapolis is located, has just welcomed new suggestions from its Democratic governor, Tim Walz. In a decree called Stay Safe Minnesota and approved on May 18th, he recommended that the only gatherings allowed are those of up to 10 people, consisting of family and friends, provided that such groups abide by the rules of social distancing. This decree also recommends wearing masks. But the incident somehow provoked out-of-control protests in Minneapolis and other cities throughout the entire country, including places with extremely restrictive pandemic rules like major cities in California and New York City. The protests quickly turned into riots marked by robbery and vandalism of private businesses, like shops and restaurants, and also brutal attacks aimed not only at police officers, but at innocent civilians and business owners who tried to defend their stores against looters. So, why are the protesters suddenly not afraid of the deadly virus? It is true that the most aggressive ones wear masks, but it isn't out of fear of infection, but rather of being identified by the law enforcement. A few years back, in the same city of Minneapolis, occurred a highly disturbing incident of shooting a white woman by a Somalian American policeman. But no protest against police brutality echoed through the country. On July 9th of 2017, the victim, an Australian American, called the police after she heard noises in the alley next to her house, which she interpreted as screams of a sexually assaulted person. When the police arrived, Justine Damond, a yoga instructor, stepped out in her bathrobe and with a cell phone in her hand. Before she even got close to the car, the fatal shot was fired. The perpetrator's defense line was as follows: "The approaching figure was a threat, so I fired to protect my partner." In the policeman's opinion, his actions were not groundless or irrational. Mohammed Noor fired without a mandatory warning, and neither he nor his partner had turned on the cameras attached to their service equipment that would have filmed the entire incident. In 2019, the court sentenced the officer to 12.5 years in prison, but the verdict met with protest from the Somali local community, which declared that the sentence was too harsh and that it was due to the color of the defendant's skin and the fact that he was a Muslim. White officers, they argued, are receiving lower sentences for murders of people of other races. But is that really so? It seems that the white victims of brutal treatment by police officers of color cannot count on the same sympathy or protest on a national scale thrown by the racial minorities. Hence, a question arises: who are the true bigots? Going back to George Floyd, described by his friends as a gentle giant, he was 6 feet 6 inches or over 2 meters tall, who was said to have a quiet personality and a beautiful spirit. Before he moved to Minneapolis from Houston in search of a fresh start, he served a sentence for burglary in 2009. Earlier in 2007, he was also convicted of robbery with a gun in hand. The fact that he was convicted twice before, of course, does not mean that the brutal treatment by the police and the following death of the detainee can be justified. Not at all. Don't we all agree on that? Because who wouldn't be against senseless police brutality? Glad we are on the same page. But then, what does it say about Justin Damon's murderer? The shot woman had no previous record. She appeared in front of the officers, completely defenseless, and the primary reason for her contacting the police was the desire to save another person from a suspected rape. However, it wasn't her, but a double convict whom the crowds throughout the country decided to honor with protests. A very disturbing picture of the whole situation is slowly beginning to emerge, and skin color has everything to do with it, and that is to demonize whites. But wait! There is more. Social media are full of findings indicating that the man in the video is not the police officer Derek Chauvin, but a crisis actor, as is George Floyd. A crisis actor is one who stages news. The one playing Officer Derek Chauvin is in reality called Benjamin Ray Bailey, also known as Ben Bailey, and some of you may recognize him from the Cash Cab TV show. Anyway, his neighbors were extremely surprised upon discovering in the news that he was a policeman. There is a word on the street that both men, the alleged murderer and the alleged victim, knew each other personally or professionally, hard to distinguish. And let me just add that the man impersonating Floyd is a highly specialized type of actor, if you know what I mean. So really, the rational conclusion is that the whole event was in fact a setup to push certain destructive influence groups to provoke riots across the country on the verge of the economic resurrection. Another shocker is Floyd's official autopsy results, according to which the cause of his death was cardiopulmonary arrest. But it also detected a whole range of other diseases, namely multifocal atherosclerosis, hypertensive disease, and, no surprise here, asymptomatic COVID. The toxicological tests revealed significant amounts of the following drugs in his blood: fentanyl, norfentanyl, N-phenethylpyperidinone, methamphetamine, 2 different versions of tetrahydrocannabinol, that is THC, the hallucinogenic component of marijuana. Further, cotinine, a product of tobacco's metabolic conversion. And finally, the presence of caffeine. It is very likely that with this amount of toxins in his system, Floyd would not survive another night, even without the help from his colleague. But if George Floyd, from the terrible murder scene, is just an actor, whose autopsy was it? Well, some Twitter researchers dug a bit more and found out that a man called George Floyd really existed, but died about 3 years ago, due to aforementioned causes. Meanwhile, George Floyd, the martyr's family, has set up a GoFundMe page and so far managed to collect over $14 million. Is the family fake or real? Let me just quote our former Secretary of State and a big loser of the 2016 presidential election, Miss Clinton, who is going to jail soon anyway. What does it matter at this point? For now, however, both the supporters and the opponents of protests accept the narrative postulating the veracity of this tragedy. And so will I, because no matter the real outcome of the altercation between those two men, I am still able to deliver a fairly clear picture of the overall situation. The protests began in Minneapolis 2 days after the incident on May 27th. By an interesting coincidence, the murder and riots took place just a week after Trump signed a presidential decree announcing the end of the country's shutdown on May 19th. The decree called on each state governor to restore normalcy and begin the phase of economic recovery, including reopening businesses and industrial production. Trump spoke very positively about the prospects of a flourishing economy, predicting that the last quarter of 2020 would be very good, but 2021 would bring a real economic boom back to the United States. But once again, the prosperity was disturbed, this time by a brutal murder and the following protests. Of course, it was shocking, but there were many brutal murders that happened in the recent history of the country. It is really suspicious that the riots erupted right after 1. The Obamagate hashtag trended #1 on Twitter and became a household name. 2. That the former US presidential candidate Hillary Clinton, commonly referred to as Hillary, is about to be interrogated in regards to the 33,000 emails she deleted. 3. After the due dates for a new investigation into Obama's espionage on Trump and his administration were set. 4. General Flynn has been cleared of the 3-year charges, and the evidence in his case begins to point to the prominent members of the Democratic Party being involved in treason. 5. Right after the pandemic, which is already falling into oblivion. 6. After the evidence of Trump's Russian collusion had turned out to be an intricate operation carried out by the Democrats in a cooperation with the high-level intelligence services to overthrow the legally elected president, and which escalated after the failed attempt to impeach POTUS. The list goes back on to the very moment when Trump first announced that he is going to run for the president of the United States. Back then, the media, altogether with the opposing political camp, began their witch hunt against the then cherished, respected businessman and a patriot who had been admired not only by politicians and celebrities, but also by ordinary people whom he had been helping in many different ways for years and years, financing their dreams about building their own businesses or studying at select universities by the means of scholarships, etc., etc. In my opinion, this is not an accident. At this point, the protests began to spread to other cities and caused aggressive confrontations with law enforcement representatives. What's even more troubling, the crowd's victims became innocent random people and peaceful protesters likewise. 2 peaceful protests organized by the local black communities were joined by the police in Michigan and New Jersey, where officers laid down their weapons in the gesture of support. Unfortunately, in most cities, protests end with unspeakable acts of vandalism and violence against others. Here's the list of the recent losses. A Las Vegas policeman fights for his life after he was shot. An officer in Bronx hit by a car and another one brutally beaten up. A passerby in Texas beaten to death. A A New York State woman defending her business attacked and beaten by both black and white perpetrators. The historic church in Washington near the White House set on fire. The Lincoln Memorial and the memorial commemorating the Second World War demolished. Several missiles fired at the presidential's headquarters. 4 policemen from St. Louis, Missouri, shot dead. 2 officers of the Federal Security Service attacked in Oakland. One of them has already died. And 60 members of the Secret Services injured in Washington. Last weekend began looting, demolition of shops, restaurants, and other businesses. NYC's Manhattan was hit harder, especially since the attacks on the stores were coordinated. That means one person broke the display window, the other one went inside and robbed equipment. In Brooklyn, 2 lawyers, one employed by a very prestigious company, were arrested for throwing Molotov cocktails at police cars. A day before, a woman from Catskills, New York, was arrested for a similar crime. And a day later, a huge crowd began a march on the headquarters of Mayor de Blasio, called Gracie Mansion, in the Upper East Side of New York City. As a result of uncontrolled riots, several states and cities introduced a curfew, including Washington, D.C., San Francisco, Santa Clara, San Jose, Walnut Creek, and Alameda County in California. In response, Trump announced that if the individual states were unable to control the situation, he would send the National Guard troops to help out. If a city or state refuses to engage the Guard, the president will then send military reinforcements. One of those who refused the presidential help was the New York mayor, Bill de Blasio. After this, the governor of New York State announced that if de Blasio wasn't to accept the help from POTUS, Cuomo had the right to dismiss him and replace him with someone else. But for now, it looks like it's just an idle threat from a Democratic governor towards a Democratic mayor. A cursory analysis shows that some Democratic state governors do not want a military intervention and turned a blind eye on the criminal behavior of rioters. Why is this happening? Well, it's because the motivations of the looters and the political sympathies of the Democratic leaders meet somewhere. This is an unsettling conclusion, but let's try and analyze it. It is no secret that the aggressive behavior coming from the rebel groups is dictated by the radical leftist ideology, supported by huge sponsorship. Such attitudes are the result of an aggressive activism channeled by some shady organizations like Antifa, Democratic Socialists of America, and even Black Lives Matter, which is being pushed through our Western educational institutions. Antifa comes from the term anti-fascist, which is a very misleading term in this context because it was coined about 90 years ago as a tool for the Bolshevik propaganda to euthanize the vigilance of the Western democracies. Because who in their right mind would not condemn fascism? The problem is that the ideologies of communism and its predecessor, socialism, have killed more people around the world than fascism will ever be able to because it has very bad PR, as opposed to socialism largely adored by the academics and their brainwashed students. However, we should not forget Lenin's own words, who laid it out straight, quote, "The goal of socialism is communism," end of quote. Going back to Bolshevism and its narrative of being anti-fascist, it is a big, fat lie. Violent tactics used by the militant mob on the American streets today wouldn't fall short of those of the old-school German Nazis. And that's exactly what makes Antifa a fascist group, which always resorts to brutal and senseless force, trying to silence all the opposition and violating the First Amendment pertaining to freedom of speech. Groups like that always lead a nation to a spiritual and material ruin and impose some kind of a totalitarian political system on everyone else. It doesn't matter that they themselves aren't capable of fully grasping on the ridiculous unicorn utopia. Because that's exactly what the puppet masters are all about. A large number of rioters, especially those who are the first to resort to violence, are the armed wing of communism and whomever is behind this ideology. Many of them do it just because they get money for it, though not all of them. Many of those who initiate riots in one state repeat it the next day in another city or state, sometimes as far apart from each other as California and New York City. Civilian journalists also discovered that Antifa members replenish pallets with bricks on the side of the streets at the rioting hotspots throughout the country. Minneapolis, Atlanta, Los Angeles, New York, Seattle, and Fayetteville in North Carolina made it to the list. It is now clear that this is a top-down, coordinated action with the help of substantial funds. The popular stereotype of an average Antifa member is an emotionally and physically unshaped soy boy, that is, a student or an alienated basement dweller sipping soy latte, because as you know, soy does not have the most beneficial effect on masculinity, and paying homage to the radical left-wing ideology. Unfortunately, it turns out that Antifa, supported by huge money, has much more dangerous potential. Some undercover journalists from Project Veritas infiltrated the group and were allowed to participate in the training in paramilitary combat techniques for carefully selected members. The leaders recommended using a wide range of dirty tricks, like sticking a finger in one's eye, kicking in the kidneys and liver, and breaking a short rib, etc. All this violence was meant for accidental, unarmed civilians who happened to have bad luck to appear in the middle of a riot. One Antifa coach called his workshop, and I quote, "a safe space for practicing aggression." End of quote. But apart from the organized youngster thugs, riots are often joined by the ordinary street bandits, tempted by the prospect of an easy loot. A regular teenager with a gun, knife, or even a brick poses a serious threat, especially to young, elderly, and disabled people who very often fell victims to rioters. Let me also draw your attention to the especially terrifying fact that a few months ago, Governor Cuomo and the New York Democrats introduced a new law called the bail reform. This law gives the police no other choice but to release a detainee in connection to crimes such as manslaughter, arson, or racial crime, because there is no bail needed anymore. A similar law was also passed in many other states. But so it happens that all of them are ruled by Democrats. And although New York recently, in April, voted to retract this bill, it won't be enforced until July, that is, after the carefully drafted wave of devastating riots initiated by Antifa and their likes, which are soon to be proclaimed domestic terror organizations anyway, sweeps through the country. It seems almost inconceivable that any US political leader would ever support such a law and any such rebellion, or that they would not care about pacifying violent riots. Not to mention rejection of help from the US president and the US army. And yet, this is exactly what happened in many places during the last few days filled with violence. The communist ideology somehow managed to break in the free American society under the guise of intolerance for intolerance, and is currently wreaking havoc on the American streets. Let me just regurgitate here the favorite invectives of the leftists, which are racist, fascist, and homophobe. The educated society somehow took no notice of the fact that any attempt to impose one's political ideology on unwilling and unsuspecting others caused by an ideology or simply money by the means of brutal force falls under the category of terrorism, either international or domestic. Fortunately, President Donald Trump knows exactly what he's dealing with, which is why he announced on Twitter on Sunday that Antifa and similar groups will soon be officially declared a terrorist organization and treated accordingly, with all its legal consequences. Inspector General William Barr announced that the Department of Justice will use the joint FBI terrorism task force to track down the criminal organizers and instigators during the recent protests so that they could be prosecuted for breaking the law against riots, established in 1968. It is the so-called Title X or Anti-Riot Act. This law defines this crime as traveling between states with the intention of inciting, promoting, encouraging, participating, and running a riot. Trump's next step in regards to taming the violent mob is to use active military forces to disperse the marauders, regardless of whether the state authorities agree or disagree. Civilian security is a priority here. National Guard troops have already been sent to Minneapolis, where the civil unrest has been pacified, and to North Carolina. On June 1st, Trump summoned troops equipped with helicopters and ground vehicles to Washington, where they handled demonstrators. Of course, the mass media immediately rigged up a lying piece, which claimed that the military confronted the peaceful protesters in a brutal way. The same peaceful protesters burned a historic church and demolished the Lincoln statue and the monument commemorating the World War II the day before. The next day, they returned and attacked the park guards, repairing the damage from the previous day by throwing bricks, bottles of frozen water, and abrasive substances at them. They also attempted to climb the Lafayette Park's fence. Additionally, glass bottles, baseball bats, and metal rods were strategically placed on the sides of the street, and during the confrontation, the crowd tried to snatch rifles from the police. The situation that Friday evening, May 29, turned out to be so dangerous that the Secret Services placed Trump and the First Lady and their son Barron in the underground bunker for about an hour. Despite all this, the police chose not to use tear gas on the demonstrators, but managed to dispel them effectively with smoking canisters without irritants and pepper balls only. After the area was cleared, Trump and Melania went to the church that had burned the day before to honor the place. The mass media once again managed to sell to the public their intentionally distorted picture of reality. To sum up the topic of the riots, I would like to shed light on a few particularly worrisome issues. Students of the University of San Diego in California demanded that they receive passing grades for the end-of-year exams without having to actually pass them. The reason is the inability to focus on studying caused by the recent riots. Some of them even openly admit that they are simply too involved with the Black Lives Matter movement. Students from Minnesota and Ohio, in turn, demanded that the university administration restricts its contacts with the local police stations. That is, reduce the police involvement during major events such as sport matches and concerts. Catering to the needs of his potential left-wing electorate, presidential candidate Joe Biden not only failed to condemn the riots, but his own staff donated a certain amount of money to certain Minnesota organizations like Minnesota Freedom Fund, which paid the bail for those arrested during the protests. Ergo, Biden, an opponent of the oppressive prison system, is a staunch advocate of the continued criminal activity sowing destruction in our communities. Similarly, the governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer, who introduced in her state a series of the most strict lockdown regulations, openly encourages looting masses to continue the ravage. This is the same politician who threatens doctors prescribing the highly effective hydroxychloroquine for COVID. The conservative organization Turning Point Action USA has of course already petitioned to recall the tyrant, and you can find the link to this petition in the description below the video. Meanwhile, the Black and Latino riot victims, whose businesses have gone up in smoke, condemned aggressive protests and called on the members of their local communities to stop the plundering and violence against those on whose behalf they are allegedly protesting. This is just another evidence that the current protests do not serve any noble social purpose, such as expressing discontent with police brutality against minorities, as we are commonly led to believe. Instead, they are simply indulging the lowest instincts and calling for criminal acts. Similarly, the left, who likes to portray themselves as defenders of oppressed ethnic, sexual, religious, insert here whatever you will, minorities, in reality uses unfavorable socio-economic situation of certain groups, sometimes factual but often just overblown, to push through their socialist utopia. The thing is, they don't really care about any minorities, even if they receive political support from them. This is perfectly illustrated by the statement made by Joe Biden, who has recently been flooding his constituents with true gems of eloquence. He said that if a black person hesitates whether to vote for Trump or Biden, well, then they ain't black. All this is just a rigged game whose goal is to introduce totalitarianism. We, Eastern Europeans, and an increasing number of South Americans like Venezuelans, who are currently suffering under the oppression of the communist regime, economically ravaging their country, know it all too well that the main instruments being used by the radical left are lies and violence. Communism is completely at odds with the US values encoded in the US Constitution. It also conflicts with the fundamental humanitarian values. Countries that do not have strongly defined political laws which would guarantee their citizens an absolute adherence to humanistic values suffer most. And a vivid example of this is currently China and its dependent territories. Quoting Kayleigh McEnany, the White House press secretary, commenting on the chaos caused by the protesters. The First Amendment does not give anyone the right to riot. The First Amendment does not give anyone the right to loot. The First Amendment does not give anyone the right to burn down buildings, deface property, or assault private citizens and police officers. The First Amendment, however, does give you the right to peaceably assemble. Now let's move on to the other events of the last few weeks. On May 28th, President Trump signed a decree to prevent censorship on the internet, defending the First Amendment, freedom of speech. In his own words, a small handful powerful social media monopolies controls a vast portion of all public and private communications in the United States. They've had unchecked power to censor, restrict, edit, shape, hide, alter virtually any form of communication between private citizens and large public audiences. There's no precedent in American history for so small a number of corporations to control so large a sphere of human interaction. The order pertains to the largest social platforms, that is Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, which have exceeded their competences. These platforms, whose main goal, according to the strict definition, is to promote businesses, violated these principles by censoring content that they did not agree with, because it was in conflict with the political sympathies of the platform owners. Not because of the content's particularly offensive character, such as promoting pornography or violent fight scenes. Let's keep in mind here that Facebook or YouTube does not bother much to hunt down creators of drastic content, which is why some users would often find themselves in a state of shock after seeing some posts and watching some videos uploaded on those platforms, even though this kind of policing would be legally justifiable because it falls within acting in so-called good faith. YouTube, however, systematically blocks conservative creators only and removes films promoting traditional or even liberal, of course in the old good positive sense of this word, values, and those that criticize the left, socialism, and communism, as well as violent radical organizations such as Antifa. who is responsible for spilling innocent blood on American streets today. And all this is being done under the guise of eliminating intolerance, racism, homophobia, hate speech, and similar nonsense. The right to censor content is a completely separate thing. It aligns with the competence of the editors of public information magazines responsible for implementing the principles of ethical journalism. None of the social media giants are formally a publisher, so they should not be censoring any content as incompatible with their ethical principles. Such censorship not only violates freedom of expression, but above all discriminates against marketing users promoting their private news sites or advertising their businesses, which in the long run undermines the entire domestic economy by hindering the free flow of business operations. These companies apparently also trade their users' personal data, track them, and try to use whatever info they gather to advertise products of those companies that quietly pay them to do so. A great example of such illegal conduct is the case of the state of Arizona, who sued Google on May 27th for consumer fraud and dishonest practices of tracking its users' location even after they turned off this option. There is also the burning question of how all these companies acquired the monopoly on the market. And again, we, Eastern Europeans, know the answer. Monopolization is the domain of the socialist, communist countries that regulate it by introducing illegal laws that ruin fair competition. There should be no doubt that similar regulations have been being smuggled into the US for a long time now, under the guise of bloodthirsty capitalism. By whom? By the covert dealers of the leftist agenda. Trump's decree will help stop the federal agencies from wasting the taxpayers' money on ads posted on the biased platforms and ensure that the Department of Justice handles over 16,000 complaints submitted by the victims of the politically motivated censorship. Those complaints were filed by users last year during the social media summit via special telephone lines. This ordinance will also mobilize states' general prosecutors to ensure that the social platform is not engaging in illegal activities. Recently, Twitter has tried to censor Trump's tweet regarding the shady activity of sending mail-in ballots in some states. Twitter overimposed the fact-checking algorithm on one of the president's posts to deny the evidence that the use of remote voting cards is associated with electoral fraud. However, Twitter made an embarrassing mistake. The Republican Congressional Committee and the Election Subcommittee published a report that revealed that in the 2018 congressional elections in two states, North Carolina and California, an electoral fraud took place by the means of the mail-in voting cards. Although the legitimate winner was a Republican candidate, a Democrat eventually entered the Congress because he inexplicably gained the advantage of several thousand votes. As a consequence of the legal intervention on the part of Judicial Watch, the conservative organization monitoring whether the government institutions are fulfilling their obligations, in May this year, California had to remove 1.5 million voters from its registers because the Los Angeles district suddenly had more eligible voters than the actual residents. The registry of those eligible to vote becomes automatically outdated as a result of residents' death or moving out to another state or country, because these people still appear on the registry, despite the fact that they no longer live in the given constituency. There is basically no order to remove oneself from the state register after a move or to remove a deceased relative by his family member. However, the federal law requires the state administration to update these records after two general elections, that is, after 2 to 4 years. Now, what happens when the state fails to do so? Well, it is possible to use the outdated data to gain an unfair advantage during the next elections. A vivid example is here the state of California, which allowed the ballot papers to be collected by people who did not have to provide any valid ID, and who weren't even citizens eligible to vote. If the ballot collectors aren't traceable because they have an illegal status, how can anyone be sure that they aren't falsifying voting results? And if they are, well, how to hold them accountable if you can't find them? Another case of an electoral fraud occurred in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where judge of elections Dominic J. DeMuro confessed a few weeks ago in a court that he had fabricated extra votes in Democratic candidates' favor and accepted bribes up to $5,000 each. In the 2014, 2015 and 2016 elections. His contribution resulted in a significant spike in the votes for the designated Democrats, that is between 15 and 22%, which is more than 1/5 of all the votes. This is why Trump is so much against approving correspondence voting. Democrats are simply using the pandemic scare to push into the bill the provisions that will allow them to further perpetuate election fraud. POTUS just recently threatened 2 states that introduced correspondence voting, Michigan and Nevada, that he will suspend federal funds for them. Following his example, the Republican Party sued the governor of California because of his recent order to distribute ballots to everyone eligible. The legal basis for the lawsuit is abusing the privilege of increased statutory powers during a crisis, COVID that is, to change the electoral rights. That's it in this week's news release. For the Polish version of the events in the US and the previous news edition in both languages, please visit our official Hello Irlandia website, to be launched soon, and our social media channels. Thank you, and have a fruitful week.